influence on agriculture. I'll now leave you with Ms. Maya McElrath and Nolo Martinez to continue the discussion.
Good morning. My name is Maya McElrath. Let's see, we're operating with several computers here, so we have lots of audio and feedback. Here we go. Nolo and he is with me right here, and he will join in the screen in a minute. Thank you again for being here. Nolo and I would like to provide a little bit of context and provide some data to illustrate why we've been able to do this project. Of course, we're incredibly grateful to the USDA leadership to have given us the ability to do the projects that we've been doing for the past 6 years. We've had lots of contact with Hispanic operators in the United States and Puerto Rico. And we continue to be able to do this work for several reasons, not just because we have great partnership with USDA and a great team to work with, but it has to do certainly with the continued growth in population, the Hispanic Latino population. As of right now, more than 60 million Hispanic individuals call the United States home. It's about 1 in 5 of all residents are Hispanic Latino, about 18%. The population has grown tremendously over the past 10 years. We had an increase of probably about 20 million individuals, of which 50% were Hispanic Latino residents. You'll see in the image in the middle, there are 6 states that actually have a Hispanic population of over 25%, meaning more than 1 in 4 individuals are Hispanic. And in Puerto Rico, 99% of the population is Hispanic. I'll click on this icon briefly. You'll see that over the 9-year periods, there was population growth for both Hispanic and non-Hispanic. However, the Hispanic population grew by 4 times the amount of the non-Hispanic population. It certainly has slowed down over the recent time, mainly due to a slowdown immigration, specifically from Mexico, and also a slower birth rate, but it continues to grow. When we look specifically at Hispanic operators, we see the increase there as well. It's very similar. Nationwide, there are, based on the U.S. Census data, there are 3.4 million producers in the United States, of which about 3% are Hispanic, 112,000. 3 states make up the largest proportion of Hispanic producers in the United States, about 60%, and that's Texas, California, and New Mexico. For context, in Texas, 41,000 Hispanic operators. There are 41,000 Hispanic operators, which is about 10% of total operators. And you'll see in New Mexico, there's actually 30% of the operators there are Hispanic, which accounts for about 12,000. Over the 5-year periods, based on, again, census data, you'll see that Hispanic operated farms increased by 8%, while the total U.S. farms decreased by 3%. So there's plenty of work for us to continue to do, and plenty for us to continue and spread across. We want to share 3 basic indicators about Hispanic operators in the United States. And before I actually do that, I did want to mention in Puerto Rico, based on 2018 census data, there are more than 8,200 operations, a reduction of about 1,300 in 2012, but still a significant number. In the United States, about 570 million acres of land is actually owned by producers. This is significant because we understand that many programs offered by USDA and NRCS, typically ownership is critical for some of these programs. So we wanted to assess the proportion of the acres that are owned by Hispanic farmers and producers. And you'll see in this case is about 3.9%, a slightly larger proportion than the total number of Hispanic producers. So about 21 million acres in the United States is owned by Hispanic producers. In Puerto Rico, about 45% of the total cuerdas, slightly bigger or smaller than an acre, a little smaller than an acre, Nolo says. About 45% of those are operated by full owners. In the United States, the mainland United States, you'll see there's an image of 5 states that have the highest percent of acres owned by Hispanic farmers, and Washington State leads by 17%. Crops and commodities, the top three crops and commodities have not changed significantly over the past 5 years between two census years and data collections. It continues to be beef, cattle, and ranching, all other crop farming, and fruit and tree nut farming. All other crop farming, just for context, includes tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, and hay, and then a collection of other smaller ones. But about 30,000 of the 112,000 Hispanic farmers in the United States are working in beef cattle ranching, which accounts for about 5% of all beef cattle ranching in the US. Excuse me, 13,000 are in other crop farming and about 11.6 thousand fruit and tree nut farming. You'll see that actually accounts for the highest percent in the United States, 12% to be exact. The final indicator that we wanted to share with regard to Hispanic operators in general has to do with internet access. We are all facing, we're all in this interesting time, to say the least. We have children at home who continue to engage in remote learning and need strong internet access. We are dependent now on our internet access and ability and connection to be able to provide information and programming. So knowing which regions have solid internet access and which ones struggle is important to us. In general, and you can see on the slide here, of the 3.4 million operators in the United States, about 45% indicated during the census to have access to internet. When you isolate Hispanic operators, it's actually interesting that that percent increases. Almost 54% of Hispanic operators indicate having internet access, which bodes well for our program and our ability to deliver some of this online curriculum. These are the top states in terms of 70% or more of the Hispanic producers indicate having access to the internet. Now, Rhode Island, you'll see it's 100%. Rhode Island only indicates having 15 Hispanic producers, and all 15 have internet access. So the percent looks large, and of course, the number is small. But regardless of that, you can see that the orange bar, the Hispanic producers with internet access, is consistently larger than the blue bar, which are total producers with internet access. When we look at the states that have at least 1,500 Hispanic producers or more, Oregon has 1,500, Texas, as we mentioned, has more than 41,000. You still see the difference between internet access of Hispanic producers compared to total producers with internet access. So now to move on to the current climate and some of the current conditions that are happening, we wanted to touch base just briefly on some COVID statistics. And again, briefly, we are bombarded repeatedly with news reports, with a tremendous amount of different sources that collect data on an ongoing basis. And it is incredibly difficult to collect data and feel that you have the most recent, most accurate. This was updated only 2 days ago. And as of this morning, when I went back to the source that we use, which is Johns Hopkins data, there are now 8.3 million cases of COVID in the United States and at least 22 deaths in the United States. In Puerto Rico, 58,000 cases with roughly 770 deaths. As of 2 days ago, the hotspots continue to creep towards the Midwest. You can see this darker highlighted area, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota. Those are really seeing some increased cases in the last few days. Similar to the per capita cases at the bottom of the top 5 states. When we did this about a week ago, Florida was among the top 5 states, but suddenly it was removed out of that section, and South Dakota actually creeped in right below North Dakota. So these 5 states now are the ones where there are between 3,500 to 4,500 cases per 100,000 residents in those states. Significant for us is to actually discuss the disparity in COVID cases. Not all states collect demographic data about the cases or deaths of individuals with COVID. Puerto Rico does not collect any demographic data, but we understand obviously that 99% of the population is Hispanic. So the majority of the cases and the deaths also will be Hispanic. For those states that do collect it, we want to look here. This image illustrates the percent of cases that are Hispanic Latino, at least 30% or more, coupled with the percent where the ethnicity is unknown. So for example, in Arizona, 1 in 3 cases are Hispanic Latino. However, also 1 in 3 cases are unknown. So don't want to make assumptions, but we could probably speculate that the proportion of Hispanic cases might be a little higher if at least half of it or a tenth of the unknowns would be counted there. For Black cases of Black residents, there are 4 states where 30% or more of the COVID cases are Black individuals. In DC, about 50% of all cases as of October 7th were Black or African Americans. The proportion of Black or African Americans in DC is about 46%. So this looks almost similar to the proportion of the population. But if we actually look at the deaths, you suddenly see a spike. So again, 40% of the population, 46% of the population in DC is Black or African American. However, they make up almost 74% or over 74% of all deaths due to COVID. There's some great discrepancies in Michigan, for example, 37, almost 38% of individuals who've passed away from COVID or COVID complications are Black African American, and the population there is only 14%. I circle back to our focus, which are, of course, Hispanic, Latino residents, Hispanic professionals, agricultural professionals. We see that in Texas, 55% of all deaths due to COVID are Hispanic, Latino. The overall population in Texas is about 40% Latino. So a disparity continues to be seen. The disparity was noted very early on in the data collection process, as early as April and May, the numbers came about. So the COVID tracking project really kind of pushed to collect as much data as possible to be able to describe the disparities moving along. The final piece that I want to discuss briefly is a little bit about essential workers before I pass it on to Nolo. The Bureau of Labor Statistics developed a standard occupational classification system that actually highlights more than 800 occupations. And the reason they've done this is for statistics purposes. They classify workers into various occupational categories for the purpose of data collection, data reporting, data collection, and the likes. During the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic, there was obviously a decision that had to be made about who are critical workers, essential workers and non-essential workers. And just briefly, and most of you perhaps will know this, but a non-essential worker is basically somebody whose duties do not impact the critical infrastructure of a city, a town, a state, or a county. Essential employees are those that need to be able to continue fulfilling their duties during or outside of a pandemic. And those include healthcare workers. You think about your emergency services, food services, and agriculture. When we look at who are essential employees, about 30% of them are going to be your healthcare workers, going to be your frontline workers in the healthcare field. But trailing right behind it, 20% are food service and agricultural workers. Now, the reason why we bring this up, a variety of them. We certainly looked at the farming occupations or agricultural occupations, but also want to reiterate that the disparity in COVID cases is also seen because a much larger proportion of Blacks and Hispanics make up that essential workforce. They're the frontline workers. When we look at the classification codes that had anything to do with farming or agriculture, you will see that of the 800 plus occupational divisions, 14 have something to do with farming, agriculture, whether technicians, sorters. And of those 14, 9 were determined to be critical. These are critical employees. These are essential employees who, of course, on the one hand, it's great to then be able to continue to work, but the danger here is that none of these frontline workers, of course, have the flexibility or the ability to do any telecommuting to continue to earn a living. They have to be in the front lines, and very little protection is offered. So there's a tremendous impact on COVID on farms for farm workers, but of course also for operators in general. There are several states that actually have a much higher proportion of their employments, there are folks employed who are in critical occupations. And I'll click on this, and I know it's a little overwhelming. You'll see here in red, the United States, about 104 million critical employees in critical occupations, about 71% of the total, meaning that these folks are needed to be able to continue really impacting the infrastructure and keep things going, the economy in the city. Mississippi is at the very top. About 75% of their workforce are in critical occupation employments. And you'll see Puerto Rico here doesn't trail far below. It's at 74%. So this is significant when we talk about how COVID has impacted agriculture in general and why it matters to really isolate and look at minority populations and the impact that it has on them. With that, I will leave you with Dr. Martinez, who will actually go a little further into the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture.
Thank you, Maya. So as a very young 60-year-old, I have to say that I have experienced a number of different situations where we have been challenged for some time that have a lot to do with how our food supply chain is affected. But nothing like this. And so I think I need to start from that point of view when it comes to how COVID and how the pandemic has interfere or impacted us all economically, obviously, in terms of farming and in terms of family households that are dependent on farm production. So I need to start with the most significant. Maya talked about the issue of labor, the farm labor, the processing, the facilities, the trucking. All of those issues that we have to think about when we think about the food chain and how those are affecting production and distribution. So the U.S. is actually quite resilient when it comes to the food supply. That means that at the short time when we have these lockdowns, we're not going to see such an impact. However, if it is longer, one thing is going to be affected, and that is that the food demand will be strained based on the fact that the system, if you think about it, by all accounts, over half of the food that we consume in the United States is not the one that we consume at home. We go outside the home to obtain. And in the graphics that we have here, if we go deeper into this graphic, we actually can see that by the time we recorded this in June, the sales of food outside the home were less than $12 million by 2020 this year. So the food supply chains changes, and to get that into the channel of the groceries will take some time. It's taking place, it's happening, but it has an impact on how we get to the distribution. The third issue that we need to mention is the fact that the pricing, those future contracts that set the price of the different commodities and the different products it is broken. And so the result is that many farmers are not getting the prices that they were expecting. And in some cases, as you guys know, the financing is going to be affected. So we need to stabilize and normalize this situation in order for those prices to go with the cost of the production. But the last thing to mention, which I think is a big impact on Hispanic farmers, is that farm households historically have used off-farm income to offset some of the losses that they have had in the farm, or they use that income to expand or to change some of the things that they do in their own farm. So many of us know that some of the essential workers or some of the people that have had to change and lost jobs or adjust to lower income, be furloughed, are going to have an impact on many things that they depend on. So the farms are going to have an impact. By having a lower supply of labor, by workers being affected because they get sick, and we see that in North Carolina where we are presently now. Others are in different places. And we see that in the meat production processing, and we see that in fruit and vegetables. By having that impact, that's going to have an impact also on the amount of food that some farmers are processing. And we'll have an example later on of a farmer in Louisiana that benefited from some of the support we provided because they're now able to get their own processing. But that's not for everyone. It doesn't happen to many farmers, and so they get to have a hit. So again, the impact of this COVID is significant. Like I said, many of us that have lived through all kinds of different challenges have not seen the impact that we're seeing now. So we have to be more innovative on outreach efforts, on seeing what the farmers need to actually be on their own, more independent, and perhaps also to make sure that we give them some security in order for them to stay in farming. It has been the case that some government help initially help for them to stay afloat and just to stay on their feet, but more needs to be done. So that's our story. We obviously continue to look at the data. There are a number of different sources that we use, and we certainly will be putting the sources up as we uplink this presentation for many of you to follow if you wish. Leave it there, and then Sarah, if you want to moderate the questions, thank you. Hi.
Hi.
Yes, thank you, guys. We open the floor up for some questions from the crowd. Just a reminder to use the Q&A feature. So the questions that we won't be able to answer will later be compiled after the symposium. Okay, now what other facts or data have you studied regarding COVID-19 that is affecting farm families?
Thank you, Sarah. Let's see. There we go. Thank you for the question, Sarah. We actually, another branch of Nolo Consulting is working very closely with a lot of early childhood education programs. We do a lot of community assessments for Head Start programs, migrant Head Start programs, and the like. And one of the services that we delivered on pretty early was a COVID addendum, essentially for folks to be able to really make a plan at the time on how to come back. It was such an unknown time. You think about what is available now, the amount of resources and data, it's really exploded. So, but for some of our very early programs in March and April, we developed a COVID addendum that we would collect statistics on language barriers, for example, or health literacy levels by whether it's by zip code or smaller sections to really hone in on do we understand how we can connect with our families, whether they're farm families or other families, on being able to read medication labels, to be able to follow instructions? We provided information on safety nets. We provided information on making sure that administrators of these programs, as well as families themselves, were aware what their rights were for TANF programs, for WIC. There were some additional benefits. Obviously, we all received a stimulus package, but there were additional funds available for different folks, or there were some, if somebody hadn't filed their taxes at some point, they still were eligible by certain deadlines. So we tried to collect as much as possible on different safety nets available for folks, rental protection, eviction protection, a lot of things that became unknowns, and there was a lot of chaos. So we continue to collect COVID data. We've slowed down a little bit because of the resources that are available. There are some amazing websites that have really kind of done what we were trying to do initially for our clients. So we continue to do that. So one question I do want to answer, because it came privately, about the sites that we use for the data for this presentation. So we rely on Johns Hopkins data collection, and actually the images that you saw were through the New York Times. They have a wonderful database that updates COVID data for every state and county, and then also countries in the entire world. The race data collection, race and ethnicity data collection, was actually from the COVID tracking project. You can go to their website and they will illustrate which states actually collect data.
Well, thank you. That's great information, not only for everybody here, but also for the minorities that we've been helping throughout all these programs and all the information that you have provided. So I would like to thank you again, and for setting the stage for our next panel. Our next panel is going to be on agriculture in the time of COVID-19. The first of our three panelists that are farmers, they have been affected by the virus in one way or another. First, we have Ms. Monica Laut Melanson from Timoy Farm in Sunset, Louisiana. Before the Q&A, we will have a short video that was recorded on Ms. Monica's farm. We do apologize for any sound impediments such as wind or farm animals.
Sarah? Can I suggest, and this is for everyone, if we just take about a 5-minute break. There are a couple of issues for that, is to make sure that everybody gets a chance for a heart break. And also, we have one panelist that is actually having some technical difficulties joining in. But if you give us 5 minutes, we'll put that on screen, and then we'll reconvene for the next session, which is the one that you just introduced.
Yeah, perfect. Again, thank you everyone for your patience. Remember that this is a live webinar, so this kind of thing does happen. But thank you, Nolo, for letting me know, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes.